Thank you. Thank you. I'm happy to be here tonight. Oh, I am happy to be here. Oh, thank you. Thank you. Oh, I am so glad to be here at Union Theological Seminary, surrounded by so many people of faith and people of conscience, beautiful souls who are dedicated to justice, not just in theory, but in practice, in daily life. In so many ways, I feel like coming to Union is like coming home. I've had the opportunity to meet with many of you in the past 2 days in classrooms and rich discussions and debates, and this feels like family, feels like home. I am in love with the spirit of this place and thrilled by the work that so many of you are doing, opening hearts and minds and transforming lives and communities. I especially want to thank Serene Jones and Judith Moyers for inviting me here tonight to participate in this wonderful lecture series. I am in awe of the steadfast commitment and remarkable contributions that both Judith and Bill Moyers have made to social justice. So to be here at Union at Judith's invitation, a work day just doesn't get much better than this. So thank you so much for having me here tonight. Well, I've been giving some thought to what I want to say tonight, a lot of thought. After all, we're all coming together here tonight to explore the meaning of race and justice at a particularly critical moment in our nation's history, a time when it seems as though we may be once again at a fork in the road. Of course, it's always tricky business to make predictions or assessments in the midst of great crisis. Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. himself pointed out that difficulty nearly a century ago. He said, quote, "Whenever I'm asked my opinion of the current state of the civil rights movement, I am forced to pause. It is not easy to describe a crisis so profound that it has caused the most powerful nation in the world to stagger in confusion and bewilderment." Well, in recent months, as our nation has reeled from Michael Brown and Eric Garner's senseless killings and the refusal of consecutive grand juries to issue indictments, confusion and bewilderment has flowed as tears, rage, shame, disbelief, and more than a bit of denial. This particular crisis may feel sudden and new to some, but its roots are as old as the country itself. We continue to live the paradox of a nation founded with the bold preamble that all men are created equal with certain inalienable rights, including life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, while at the same time denying all of those basic civil and human rights to slaves and writing into the original Constitution the rule that Black people counted as only 3/5 of a human being. This paradox of a nation founded with lofty ideals of freedom and equality, but extending those ideals primarily to wealthy white men is the founding paradox of our nation, and it remains a paradox to this day, even now as a Black man sits in the Oval Office. For years now, I have been obsessed with this paradox. Not its theoretical existence, but its concrete manifestation in the brutal system of mass incarceration, a penal system unlike anything this world has ever seen. I've been obsessed. I have been traveling from coast to coast, speaking to just about anyone who will listen, saying pretty much the same thing over and over again. I have been talking about the ways in which our nation, from its founding, from the very, very beginning, has repeatedly birthed and maintained extraordinary systems of racial and social control, and continues to do so even now, even as most of us claim to be colorblind, even in the age of Obama. Over and over and over, I've repeated the basic facts. More African Americans are under correctional control today, in prison or jail, on probation or parole, than were enslaved in 1850, a decade before the Civil War began. And since John Legend repeated those words at the Academy Awards, people have said, and I've heard people saying, well, those numbers really aren't so bad because there are a lot more black people, alive today than there were back then, so those numbers aren't so bad. And it's true that mass incarceration doesn't affect everyone. In fact, it affects a relatively small segment of American society, one defined by race and class. But within that segment, it has come for nearly everyone. Nationwide, about a third of black men can expect to spend time behind bars, but if you lack a high school diploma, as many do, as most do in many inner city communities, that figure rises to about 60%. And then if you count all those who have been saddled with criminal records who may have been lucky enough to get just felony probation, never mind the millions who are all stopped, frisked, searched, and monitored for no good reason at all, as well as all of the thousands who are cited for loitering or jaywalking in the name of broken windows policing, the practical equivalent of the black codes in poor communities of color. Well, now you're beginning to get a picture of entire communities defined by race and class under perpetual correctional control or surveillance and relegated to a permanent second-class status. In many urban areas today, more than half of working-age African-American men now have criminal records and are thus subject to legalized discrimination for the rest of their lives. In cities like Chicago, Detroit, Philly, Newark, and likely New York, the statistics are even worse. And once branded a criminal or felon, you're ushered into a parallel social universe in which the basic civil and human rights that apply to others no longer apply to you. You may be stripped legally of the very rights supposedly won in the civil rights movement, like the right to vote, the right to serve on juries, and the right to be free of legal discrimination in employment, housing, access to education, and basic public benefits. So many of the old forms of discrimination that we supposedly left behind during the Jim Crow era are suddenly legal again once you've been branded a felon. That's why I say we haven't ended racial caste in America. We've merely redesigned it. In many ways, it seems as though that the birth of this new caste-like system was foreshadowed by the U.S. Constitution itself. Perhaps we should have all seen this coming. For the 13th Amendment in the United States, ratified following the Civil War, explicitly abolished slavery and involuntary servitude, except as punishment for a crime. That's the loophole. It's not true that slavery has been abolished in the United States. It's simply not true. If you've been convicted of a crime, the U.S. Constitution says slavery is just fine. And in the 14th Amendment, which was adopted with the express purpose of eradicating the vestiges of slavery and guaranteeing the right to vote and equal treatment under the law, the same loophole appears again. Section 2 of the 14th Amendment states that the one person, one vote principle and the right to vote itself cannot be abridged except in cases of rebellion or punishment for a crime. It seems now, in retrospect, that the U.S. Constitution itself nearly provided instruction for the legal formation of the next caste system. It states quite explicitly that you may not enslave or deny equal treatment of the law or the right to vote or relegate any citizen to permanent second-class status unless you first brand them a criminal. And then at that moment, they are deemed to have no humanity at all and can be subject to precisely the same treatment as a slave. Over and over to audiences large and small in prisons and reentry centers, on college campuses, churches, judicial conferences, just anywhere, people will listen to me. I've been repeating the same message, that we as a nation have done it again. And I've been trying to expose the myths that have kept us asleep and in denial, passively accepting this human rights nightmare that is occurring on our watch. These powerful myths, especially the myth that the explosion in our prison system can be explained simply by crime and crime rates. It's not true. It's just not true. There's this myth that somehow black and brown folks have just brought all of this on themselves. And the data, the research shows it's just not true. Once I finally, very belatedly, woke up to the reality of this criminal injustice system and came to realize that it is not just another institution in our society infected with racial bias, but a primary engine of racial inequality in the United States, and that we will never achieve quality education for poor kids of color or meaningfully address chronic joblessness and hopelessness as long as we continue to wage wars on the most vulnerable and lock them up en masse into a permanent second-class status. Once it became clear to me that this punitive impulse towards them, the others, this impulse to control, enslave, and punish them lies at the root of all our divisive racial politics infecting every single social justice debate, not just about crime, but also about education, zero tolerance, healthcare, housing, the minimum wage and beyond, making a progressive alliance between poor and working class white folks and folks of color nearly impossible, as we are constantly pit against one another, encouraged to blame ourselves and one another rather than grasping the bigger picture and asking the bigger questions and seeing our shared interests and dreams. Once I began to see that this pervasive punitive impulse towards poor people of color has less to do with crime than our racial history and our racial present, which is why our criminal justice system functions more like a system of racial and social control than a system of crime prevention and control. Once I came to see this and finally woke up myself, I became obsessed. And so here I am, tempted yet again to give you all a new Jim Crow lecture. An overview of the war on drugs and the war on crime and how it all actually works as opposed to how it's advertised, and how these wars, and more importantly, the war mentality, the us versus them, search and destroy, lock them up and throw away the key, has decimated communities of color, and how our legal system has conspired to keep millions cycling in and out of prison for the rest of their lives. I'm tempted. For I know that many people in this audience think that they know how the system works, just like I once did, but really don't. Some of you may think that you know how bad it is, how discriminatory, how the legal system is rigged, but you don't really know the half of it, just like I once thought that I knew but didn't. But in the short time that I'm here tonight, I really don't want to talk any more about the problem and how we got here. Instead, I want to wrestle with the big question, the elephant in the room. What does all this mean for us, for people of faith, people of conscience? What are we called to do? At this moment in our nation's history, what does our faith and conscience demand of us? Now, don't get me wrong, understanding the problem, really understanding it and how we got to this moment in our nation's history is critically important. If we don't really know our history, truly understand it, we are doomed to repeat it. Nothing could be more clear to me now. But what I really want to do, what I feel moved to do tonight, is to challenge us to think about what this means for us as people of faith, people of conscience. But I must say, in challenging us to wrestle with this question, I want to make clear that I'm not pretending to have any special insight into the answer. I am not a theologian. I believe that we desperately need a multiracial, multi-ethnic, interfaith theology of liberation for this era of mass incarceration. But I'm not here to offer a theology tonight. Instead, I'm here to tell you why I think we need one. For much of my adult life, I have been involved in various efforts to reform our justice system, or obtain something like justice for people who have been discriminated against, abused, locked up, locked out, and disposed of like garbage. It took me, as a civil rights lawyer, a long while to wake up to the reality that a new Jim Crow had been born. But what I can tell you from my years of experience as a civil rights lawyer, as a legislative advocate, as a coalition builder, as a media advocate, is this. Ultimately, this freedom struggle will not be won in the courtrooms or in halls of power. There is no legal strategy or set of policy arguments that will end this history and cycle of creating caste-like systems in America. For what we have here is a crisis of conscience. The truth is we've become the most punitive nation in the world, and the roots of our punitiveness have a great deal to do with race. Our relentless punitive impulse, the recurring impulse to punish and control poor people and people of color rather than view them as worthy of care, compassion, and concern. What we face is a profound moral and spiritual crisis, not merely a failure of public policy. Mark Maurer, the executive director of the Sentencing Project, published the results of research in his book, great book, The Race to Incarcerate. The research showed that the most punitive nations in the world are the most diverse. The most lenient, the most compassionate nations are the most homogeneous. It seems that an aspect of human nature is a punitive impulse towards those we label the others. And so perhaps it should come as no surprise that a vicious backlash against the civil rights movement, manifesting as law and order and a get tough movement, combined with the economic collapse of inner city communities across America, led to the birth of a penal system unlike anything the world had ever seen. Indeed, it now seems fair to say that the future of American democracy itself, as it continues to diversify in the years to come, and with increasing economic inequality, rests on whether we as a people ultimately rise to the challenge that this multiracial, multi-ethnic experiment in democracy presents and find a way to care for each other, genuinely care for each other, across the innumerable lines of race, class, ethnicity, and difference. If we are serious about doing more than just tinkering with the mass incarceration machine, if we are serious about breaking our nation's habit of creating massive systems of racial and social control, if we are serious about rising to the challenge that this paradox of America presents, then people of faith and people of conscience are going to need to step up in a big way and show tremendous courage, speak unpopular and inconvenient truths, and offer a vision for justice that transcends the politics of power and privilege. I am speaking now most especially to students here at Union. Do not look to the lawyers to do the work of defining what justice means, though we certainly need lawyers today, their skills and their talents as much as we need anyone. Do not look to the policymakers to define a vision of what the beloved community might look like once the walls of Jericho come tumbling down. We need our policymakers, creative, determined, inspired policymakers who are capable of imagining alternatives and designing meaningful alternatives to the status quo. But I hope we never imagine, not even for a moment, that there is some quick policy fix that is going to solve the ultimate dilemma we face. And whatever you do, please do not look to the politicians to provide moral vision or courage, especially President Barack Obama. Yes, we need far more courage from our elected leaders for sure, but do not look to them, for we're looking to you. It may not seem like people of faith, people of conscience, people of courageous moral vision are in high demand right now. After all, it seems that nearly every week there's some new poll or study showing that Americans are becoming ever more disenchanted with religion and drifting away from their faiths, and becoming more cynical about politics. But for the past 5 years, I've been speaking to thousands of people all over the country. And one of the questions that I hear over and over again is, who will be our Martin Luther King Jr.? Who will be our leader in this movement to end mass incarceration? Now, this question used to really annoy me. because I do not believe that we should be waiting around for some magical, mythical leader to appear who will lead us all to the promised land like some Pied Piper with the rest of us following behind, whistling their tune. I am not a fan of the big leader to the rescue school of thought, and so this question has bothered me for some time. But recently I've started listening more carefully when the question is asked, who will be our Dr. King? And I've come to believe that what people are really asking for isn't necessarily a leader to the rescue, but instead they're expressing a deep need and a sincere desire for the kind of bold moral vision and radical alternative narrative, and a model of courageous risk-taking and sacrifice that was offered by Dr. King and by Malcolm X in his way. I believe what they're asking for everywhere I go, whether they may know it or not, is what Dr. Cornel West has aptly called prophetic fire. And let me be clear that when using that term, I do not mean to evoke images of men at pulpits belling about justice and pounding the lectern. I mean, this is a Women of Spirit lecture, after all. And yes. And on that note, I remember when, I was in law school, I attended a panel where the topic was hate speech. And there was this young female professor named Mari Matsuda on the panel. And she was a beautiful, young Asian American woman, very petite. And she sat very still and very serene while her other male panelists carried on, making points and jabbing their fingers in the air, and all of them insisting that while of course we must abhor hate speech, we must, absolutely must, value the First Amendment right to say anything to anyone, anywhere. That First Amendment right must be deemed inviolate. Talking over one another, interrupting anyone, reaffirming the First Amendment. And then when it was her turn to speak, she spoke quietly and calmly, and with such extraordinary conviction and yet humility that the whole room just hushed and hung on her every word. You could literally hear a pin drop. And she spoke what amounted to heresy in that elite law school setting. She said that she believed that the 14th Amendment, which guarantees the principle of equal treatment under the law, and which was adopted following a civil war with the express purpose of ridding our nation of a racial caste system that made a mockery of our democracy, must be the one principle of our Constitution that trumps them all. And therefore, in her view, no one in the United States should be viewed as possessing a constitutional right to engage in hate speech. Now, I cannot tell you what a powerful impact she had on me, and it wasn't what she said so much, but how she said it. She was utterly fearless in speaking her truth, and she was refusing to resort to the tactics of power and control, arguing and interrupting and intimidating others into agreement or acquiescence or silence. She was on fire in the most beautiful way, unlike anything I had ever quite seen before. And so when I say to you, students at Union, that we are looking to you, we desperately need you to bring your prophetic fire, I'm asking you, begging you to speak in your own voice, your own truth, and with a fearlessness and a determination that honors your most sacred beliefs and moral commitments. We need you, students of morality and students of theology, to speak your truth so that we might all muster the courage to do the same. I personally have been struggling to muster my own courage. And I will be eternally grateful for one man who helped me to see that I could no longer hide from the spiritual dimensions of my own work. I met him a few years ago while I was on the road talking about my book and the phenomenon of mass incarceration. And at the time, I was struggling with a feeling of depression and anxiety, worrying that all of the work that I had put into writing the new Jim Crow had all been for nothing. It had begun as a strange, nagging feeling, actually a voice in my head, or this recurring thought that kept repeating itself after every speech. The voice said, quietly but clearly, all sound and fury but signifying nothing. And I was at a loss as to why I would be hearing such a voice in my head. I started thinking that God or the spirits of my ancestors were trying to send me a message, that the work that I'd been doing was for naught, that it all meant nothing, that I was accomplishing nothing. And it's difficult to explain the distress that this thought, this recurring thought, this voice was causing me. I should point out that my book had not yet become a bestseller. In fact, I was struggling mightily to get anyone to listen to the message I was desperately trying to share. I was speaking in nearly empty church basements and to small crowds, often begging people to let me come and share my message. Over the time, crowds began to grow in size, thanks in part to Bill Moyers and Amy Goodman, who were among the first people to grant me an interview. But I was getting tired, and I was on the road away from my young children. I'm actually quite an introvert by nature, so getting up in front of large crowds over and over again was scary and draining. But I was doing it trying to share the facts, wake people up, tell the history, share the data. And then as I was trying to walk off the stage, I would hear all sound and fury and signifying nothing. And then a moment of truth came. I was invited by the late, great Vincent Harding, Dr. Vincent Harding, to speak at the Iliff School of Theology in Denver. And when I arrived, he welcomed me like a long-lost friend, and then he sat me down and told me that he was grateful for my research and writing, but that's not why he invited me. He said in his slow, low, and steady voice, "The reason I invited you here, my sister, daughter, niece, and friend, isn't because you gathered the evidence to indict the system. No, I invited you because you wrote that the time had come for us to stand with the despised, the accused, the convicted, the least of these. You didn't use the words of Jesus," he said, "but I hear them. What you do unto the least of these, my brethren, you do unto me." And then he leaned in towards me, held my gaze silently for a moment, and said, "Now that's the real message, right?" And I'm not sure that I knew it then, but that was the beginning of the end of the voice in my head. I began to awaken to a new understanding of my own mission and purpose. My job wasn't simply to speak as a lawyer or as an advocate or as an academic railing against the system. Thanks to Dr. Harding's gentle blessing and reminder, I felt called that I was to do my best to share a deeper, more profound message about the meaning of this moment in our nation's history, and to do the work with others to inspire an awakening to the moral and spiritual dimensions of mass incarceration. I came to see that a large part of my job, perhaps the most important part of my job, was to dig for deeper truth and to speak that truth with a lot more courage. Over the years, and especially in recent months, I have found that too often in our rush to respond to a crisis or to a tragedy, another police killing, or in our rush to take action and just do something about something, we skip that critical, all-important step of asking the question, what is the truth? Not just the facts of who said what and when, what came first or later, not just the data and the statistics, the cost of this or that, not the debate about what the witnesses saw, were his arms really raised all the way up? How many seconds did it take before the police pulled the trigger? No, I mean, what is the truth? The deeper truth, the truth that holds the power to transform, to awaken, to shake the foundations and allow something new and beautiful to burst forth. What is the deeper truth? And then once we begin to glimpse that truth, once we get a glimpse of it, it's not enough to just hold it in our minds and play around with it like some kind of intellectual jigsaw puzzle. If we're to make our lives useful, if we are to be worthy of this magnificent gift called life, then we've got to get serious about sharing the fruits of this truth. I would go so far as to say we must be the fruits of this truth. In the end, there's just no escaping it. I mean, one truth about the truth is that it never goes away. It always comes back, resurfacing in new forms, sometimes masquerading in different guises, but always shows up again, daring us to face it. So will we face it? Will we face the truth, speak the truth in this time, in this age? Here's another truth about the truth. In every time and in every age, there are those who will deny the truth and those who will courageously confront it and do their best to rise to the challenge that moment in history presents. Now, I remember when I was a kid in school, I was so ashamed and demoralized whenever teachers would start talking about slavery or Jim Crow. The textbooks would show pictures of black people hanging from trees or whites only signs, and I read about the fact that, people who looked like me were forced to sit at the back of the bus. And my teacher said they wanted us to see these pictures and learn the truth about slavery so we could understand the segregation and the horror of it all. But my teachers, as well-intentioned as they were, did not tell the whole truth. They taught us about the pain and the suffering and the cruelty, the dehumanization, but they didn't say much about the courage, the resistance, the love that endured, the songs that were born in cotton fields, and the magnificent movements that were led by people who could barely read, could not vote, people who are thought to be less than human. As Dr. Harding has written, there is a river of courage, love, and rebellion, and creative, nonviolent action. A beautiful river runs through it all. And that's the truth, too, the whole truth. And the question, I think, as we gather tonight is whether we are going to face the truth of our times and join that beautiful river, that raucous, sometimes dangerous river, or not. Are we willing to join that river and widen that river so it eventually engulfs us all, carrying us downstream to a place we all belong, or not? Now, I don't want to get carried away with metaphors here. I want to be very clear and explicit about my meaning. When I say that we need a multiracial, multi-ethnic, interfaith theology of liberation for this era of mass incarceration, I am saying that we are called to build a new moral consensus in this country, a revolutionary understanding about who we are as human beings, who we are as children of God, and what we owe one another. And I'm not using this word revolutionary as mere rhetorical flair. After years of piecemeal policy reform and tinkering with the machine, I now finally understand what Dr. King meant when he said, just months before his death, after Selma, after the Civil Rights Acts and the Voting Rights Acts had been passed, he told a reporter, quote, "For years, I labored with the idea of reforming the existing institutions of the society, a little change here, a little change there. Now I feel quite differently. I think you've got to have a reconstruction of the entire society, a revolution of values," end quote. Frustrated by white resistance to addressing in any meaningful way decaying ghettos, failing schools, structural joblessness, and crippling poverty, Dr. King said that America must be reborn. He said, quote, "The dispossessed of this nation, the poor, both white and Negro, live in a cruelly unjust society. They must organize a revolution against that injustice, not against the lives of their fellow citizens, but against the structures through which the society is refusing to lift the load of poverty," end quote. And then, when speaking to his staff at the Southern Christian Leadership Conference in 1967, staff who were concerned that the civil rights movement had lost its steam and direction, King said the time had come to shift from a civil rights movement to a human rights movement. Political reform efforts were no longer adequate to the task at hand. He said, quote, "For the past 12 years, we have been in a reform movement. But after Selma and the Voting Rights Bill, we moved into a new era, which must be an era of revolution. We must see the great distinction between a reform movement and a revolutionary movement. We are called upon to raise certain basic questions about the whole society," end quote. Well, today, I fear that many civil rights lawyers and advocates like myself have been stuck in a model of advocacy that King was determined to leave behind. rather than challenging the basic structure of our society and doing the hard work of movement building on behalf of poor people of all colors, we have been tempted too often by the opportunity of people of color to be included within the political and economic structure as is. And we allowed ourselves to be willfully blind to the emergence of a new caste system, a system of social excommunication that has denied millions of poor people and people of color basic human dignity. I don't think the significance of this can be overstated, for the failure to acknowledge the humanity and dignity of all people has lurked at the root of every caste system. This common thread explains why in the 1780s, the British Society for the Abolition of Slavery adopted as its official seal a woodcut of a kneeling slave above a banner that read, "Am I not a man and a brother?" That symbol was followed more than 100 years later by signs worn around the necks of black sanitation workers during the Poor People's Campaign, answering the slave's question with a simple statement, "I am a man." And yet here we are, decades later, with a black man in the White House and most Americans claiming to be colorblind, and thousands of people are holding signs eerily reminiscent of eras we supposedly left behind, reminding a forgetful nation that Black lives matter. The fact that a sign is necessary like that today in protest of yet another caste-like system suggests that the model of civil rights advocacy that has been employed for the past several decades is not, as King predicted, adequate to the task at hand. If we can agree that what is needed now at this critical juncture is not mere tinkering or tokenism, but as King insisted more than 40 years ago, a radical restructuring of our society, then perhaps we can also agree that a radical restructuring of our approach to advocacy is in order as well. And I dare say, though I'm not a theologian, perhaps a radical new approach to our theology is in order as well. For those of us who consider ourselves people of faith and people of conscience, we must acknowledge that we have been far too quiet for far too long as our nation built a penal system predicated on denying to God's children the very forms of forgiveness, compassion, and opportunities for redemption that we claim to cherish. What sort of theology tolerates this complicit silence? Perhaps the revolution must first begin within us. Of course, there are those who tell me that my newfound revolutionary spirit is misplaced, especially now that there is so much progress being made through traditional political channels to end mass incarceration in America. I'm often asked, aren't I thrilled by marijuana legalization? Aren't I delighted that the Koch brothers and Newt Gingrich are sitting down at the same table with the ACLU and the Center for American Progress to come up with a grand plan to end mass incarceration? Aren't I glad that President Obama granted clemency to 8 people convicted of nonviolent drug offenses? Isn't it great that the Justice Department just issued a report finding a pattern of practice of discrimination in the Ferguson Police Department? Aren't I delighted that the new mayor of New York City finally settled the stop and frisk case? Over and over again, people asked me, did you ever think back when you were writing your book that any of this would be possible? And I have to say, yes. 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 I definitely thought it was possible, and in many ways, it is what I feared. As a nation, we are on the verge of doing many of the right things for the wrong reasons. Now, don't get me wrong, I am a supporter of marijuana legalization. In fact, I believe that the simple possession of all drugs for personal use should be decriminalized. I believe we should follow the example set by Portugal, which has decriminalized all drugs, the simple possession of all drugs, and after 10 years, they reported rates of drug addiction and abuse went down as they reinvested all that money they spent caging people into drug treatment and providing education and support to people who may be at risk of drug addiction. And I am glad there is emerging bipartisan support for reducing harsh mandatory minimum sentences for some nonviolent drug crimes, as well as reforms for, mentally ill people that make it more likely that they'll get health care treatment rather than a jail cell. But When considering whether marijuana legalization and the recent bipartisan initiatives represent genuine progress, and by that I mean truly transformational change, I think we should ask ourselves, have we as a nation changed our minds about the dignity and value of those people whose lives have been destroyed by the drug war? Or have we simply changed our minds about marijuana? If legalization is motivated primarily by our changing views of the drug, the growing consensus in the medical community that marijuana is actually less harmful than alcohol or tobacco, but our views about them, those who have been targeted en masse for minor drug crimes, hasn't really changed, then we haven't made much progress from a racial justice perspective. Similarly, we've got to ask ourselves whether the primary engine driving the new bipartisan enthusiasm for criminal justice reform, whether that enthusiasm has been driven primarily by a new awakening to the value of the lives and communities that have been destroyed, or is this enthusiasm driven primarily by concerns about the costs of this massive prison state and reluctance to raise taxes on the predominantly white middle class? Truly transformative change will come when and only when we change rules, laws, policies, and practices because we have opened our hearts and our minds for the better regarding the dignity and value of all people, of all colors, no matter who they are, where they came from, or what they may have done. Yes. By doing the right thing for the wrong reasons, we save lives today only to lose them tomorrow. For what we know, what we certainly ought to know by now, is that systems of racial and social control adapt and morph over time, adapting to the needs and constraints of the time. And ultimately, what lies at the core of the current caste system is a flawed public consensus, a failure to care, to really care across the lines of race and class, the belief that some lives simply don't matter. And it is this failure to care that lies at the core of every caste-like system that has ever existed in the United States or anywhere else in the world. So I rejoice for the lives that may be spared by this new bipartisan alliance, but I am filled with grief for the lives we will certainly lose tomorrow if we do not find a way to steer this ship in a radically different direction and develop a new moral consensus. And so, yes, I am glad that the new mayor of New York, has stopped fighting the brilliant litigation brought by the Center for Constitutional Rights challenging the city's discriminatory and abusive stop and frisk practices. But I have to pause and take a deep breath as I consider how far he and we have truly come. For even as he entered into a landmark consent decree and spoke the truth about his son and what he needs to be aware of when dealing with the police, he has practically in the same breath clung to and reaffirmed the cruel and immoral doctrine known as broken windows policing. And for those who are unfamiliar, broken windows policing is the notion that the best way to make our community safe and secure is to come down with a hammer on people who commit the most minor of infractions. Not on all people, of course, for broken windows policing is not practiced in the wealthy neighborhoods, but only in the poorest and most vulnerable communities of color. The notion that to effectively deal with them, the others, we must arrest and fine and cite people en masse for things like selling untaxed cigarettes, riding a bicycle on the sidewalk, or jaywalking. This zero-tolerance, purely punitive mentality and impulse believing this is how you make a community safe. This is how you keep them under control. This belief system lies at the very root of all that is wrong with so much of our politics and our justice system today. Perhaps you've heard the old saying, when all you've got is a hammer, then everything looks like a nail. And when it comes to poor communities and communities of color, all we bring is the hammer. Everyone in these communities is treated as nails, nails to be pounded down, beat down, controlled, beat into submission. Now, I will not deny that broken windows are a sign of distress in a community if they are a regular occurrence. Just like trash in the streets or hostile graffiti on the walls, When plentiful, those are signs. And I'll be the first to acknowledge that ignoring these signs of distress comes at a price that is paid first and foremost by the people who live in those communities. The critical question, though, is how do we respond to these signs? Do we bring the hammer? Or do we, I'm asking you as people of faith and people of conscience, do we not have other tools at our disposal? And if we do, and I know we do, what sort of crime in the eyes of God do we commit by failing to use them? And please do not believe it when people say, oh, these are only little misdemeanor offenses. No big deal. We need not be too concerned about these citations, these misdemeanor arrests. For after all, it was just a minor misdemeanor that Eric Garner was accused of, selling loose, untaxed cigarettes when a police officer saw fit to choke him to death for his crime. Of course, that's an extreme case, yet the point remains, if you know anything at all about how this system works, you know that if you're poor, you likely can't pay that misdemeanor fine. And you might lose your job because of the time you spent showing up in court. And these misdemeanor offenders, they too can follow you for the rest of your life in this era of technology. They can show up on background checks. They can be the reason you're denied employment, denied access to housing. And suddenly this little misdemeanor offense is the reason you're unemployed or homeless. And now this little misdemeanor is being used against you in your sentencing hearing because you robbed a convenience store or sold some weed because you were hungry or desperate for cash. And then the judge looks at you and says the words, repeat offender. And the prosecutor says, yeah, he's nothing but a troublemaker. He's had a number of run-ins with the law. So yes, it matters. It really matters when we show up in the lives of poor people with nothing but a hammer. Jesus taught that he who is without sin should cast the first stone. Well, we have become a nation of stone throwers. And in this era of mass incarceration, it is not enough to drop your own stone. We have got to be willing to catch the stones raining down on the most vulnerable, and we must be willing to stand up to the stone throwers and disarm them. I believe we now find ourselves at a fork in the road. We can continue down the road most traveled, the road of business and politics as usual, the path of reforming our political institutions here and there, the path Dr. King was determined to leave behind. Or we can choose a different path, the rocky, dangerous path that comes without a map. It's a path that's beckoning us again, thanks in large part to the courage of the young people in Ferguson who stood up when Michael Brown was shot down and inspired thousands of people to wake up, get up, and march here in New York City and beyond. If we choose this rocky path, there will be no guidebook, no map, no instructions. All we will have is our moral compass and the whisperings of the angels and our ancestors in our ears reminding us to dig for deeper truth and to speak and to act with greater courage. Reminding us, in the words of Dr. James Cone, that humanity's salvation is available only through our solidarity with the crucified people in our midst. As I see it, proving that solidarity means being willing to speak unpopular, difficult truths, never avoiding the racial dimensions or the profound moral questions for purposes of expediency. It means never seeking justice on the cheap, but always demanding full restoration and reparation for those who have been harmed the most. It means being on fire for justice and believing with undying faith that the slaves who sung songs of freedom in the cotton fields and the immigrants who are toiling in the fields today and those who risked their lives on the freedom rides or who marched in Selma and those who faced tear gas in Ferguson and those who marched carrying signs saying Black Lives Matter on the streets of New York City were not foolish to believe that America can be born again. We can and we must build a movement to end not only mass incarceration and mass deportation, but a broad-based, radical human rights movement that ends once and for all our history's cycle of creating caste-like systems in America. A movement for education, not incarceration, jobs, not jails. A movement to end all forms of legal discrimination against people released from prison, discrimination that denies them basic human rights to work, to shelter, to food. A movement for voting rights for all, including those behind bars. Voting rights for people who are prisoners is common in other Western democracies, but not here in America. A movement that will end the war on drugs once and for all and shift to a public health model for dealing with drug addiction and drug abuse. A movement that will stand up to the police unions and transform the police itself from warriors into peace officers directly accountable to the communities they serve. Yes. A movement that will ensure that every dollar saved from ending the wars that have been declared on poor communities of color, the wars on crime and drugs, will be reinvested back into those communities, the communities most harmed. Meaningful reparations and justice reinvestment. A movement that abandons our purely punitive approach to dealing with violence and violent crimes and embraces a more restorative and rehabilitative approach, one that takes seriously the interests of the victim, the offender, and the community as a whole. A movement that is rooted in the awareness of the dignity and humanity of us all, no matter who we are, where we came from, or what we may have done. I believe it will be said when the history of this movement is written that this place, Union Theological Seminary, was at the forefront, offering for all people of all colors, ethnicities, and faiths a theology of liberation, an ethics of justice, a vision of what love looks like in public. I pray that this year, 2015, will be the year that King's revolution was finally born, the nonviolent revolution he prayed for and died for. Finally, the sleeping giant woke up, got up, and walked, and chose the road less traveled. And that, I believe, historians one day will say, ultimately made all the difference. Thank you so much for having me here tonight. Thank you.
I'm at a loss as to where to begin the process of asking questions and involving everyone. And I just want to say thank you so much for your courage and your clarity and everything. When we think about this pre-revolutionary moment and the movement that we are looking for, finding the leaders who have that combination of compassion and heart and clarity to work with that clear and precise critical analysis and the ability to see with focus where we need to go and not to be distracted by the things that spin around us, trying to lead us off in the wrong direction. That is a rare thing, and we have that in you, and you are blessing all of us with your leadership.
Thanks.
Thank you. So we have time for just 2 questions, and I have had these questions given to me on an iPad. So I think the first one is one that we've been wrestling with here, is how do you relate mass incarceration and the new Jim Crow to immigration detention?
That is such a good question. You know, I had the opportunity to speak with a wonderful group of union students earlier today, and this question came up then as well, and I think it's so important. And, you know, I am a big believer that the movement to end mass deportation should not be separate in any way from the movement to end mass incarceration, that they are one movement. They ought to be viewed as one movement because at their core, they're about precisely the same thing. It's about whether we view poor people of color as people who are deserving of our care, compassion, and concern, or whether we respond with a purely punitive impulse towards them. And what we see with the call to get tough and crack down on immigrants and the calls from some to deport even children back to countries where they might face certain death, this willingness to dispose of the others is at the core of the drug war, of the wars that have been declared domestically on poor people of color in the United States in various forms, and that we ought to view the movement and the mass criminalization of immigrants and mass deportation as part of the same movement to end mass incarceration. It's about fundamentally whether we care about poor people and people of color and what kind of basic human rights and dignity we feel they deserve. But I think there's some real challenges to getting there. There's two in particular that come to mind. One is that within the immigrant rights movement itself, there has been a tendency among many well-intentioned advocates to say things like, we're not criminals. We're immigrants, we're good, hardworking criminals, we're good, hardworking people, we're not criminals. And I've seen in some marches for immigration reform and immigration signs that literally say, we are not criminals, right? Well, once you say that, say, we're not them. We are not criminals, the bad people. We're the good people. Therefore, we're deserving of your care, compassion, and concern. You've developed a fault line within the movement. I believe that we should honor the criminality within all of us. Because the reality is that we are all criminals. We are all criminals. We are all criminals, just as we are all sinners. We've all done wrong in our lives. We've all made mistakes. This idea that the criminals are them, not us. We're not the criminals, they're the criminals. The criminals are other people, not us. It's pure fiction. If you're an adult, you've broken the law at some point in your life. You have. We're all sinners, we're all criminals, but some of us are punished for our mistakes for the rest of our lives. Some of us are treated as inherently disposable. That's the issue. It's not whether some of us make mistakes or not, or whether some of us are sinned, or whether some of us have committed crimes or not. It's that we are all human beings worthy of care, compassion, and concern. Now, of course, that doesn't mean that some people don't need to be removed from our society for a period of time. If someone commits a violent crime that poses risk to our community, do they need to be removed? Of course we do. Of course they do. But I am a prison abolitionist in the sense that I believe we should end prisons as we know them, as sites of dehumanization and cruelty and humiliation. And we need to reimagine what justice looks like for people who have committed violent crimes. And so I am a big believer that we need to join these movements, but we also need to address the divisions that exist within them. One of the other major challenges for bringing these movements together is that many African Americans, I'm sad to say, resent Latino immigrants. There's a lot of fear that Latino immigrants are taking their jobs, taking away from them. And what we have are, folks, fighting over crumbs thrown from the table. And so we have got to change that mentality of, are they taking from us? Are they taking our jobs away from us? And say, no, we all have basic human rights to work, to quality education, to security, to housing. We all have basic human rights. And that impulse to say, they're taking my job, therefore I want to punish them or control them or dispose of them, is precisely the same thing that led poor and working class whites in the South, as the civil rights movement was getting underway, to say, no, I don't want them taking my job. I don't want to have to compete with them on equal terms. It's fear that keeps us divided and apart, fighting over crumbs thrown from the table, rather than recognizing the dignity and humanity of us all and standing in solidarity with each other as we build a truly revolutionary human rights movement on behalf of us all.
So another question, and this will be the last one, and it's a huge question. You pointed out early that this punitive, dominating dynamic of control is more prevalent in cultures that are diverse. It seems to me that in the United States, though it adheres to, you could say it's cross-race, but it's particularly tied up with white identity, and that thinking and talking about whiteness and its brutality is a key part of this, rather than always in sort of general racialized categories with respect to that punitive impulse, and its roots also in very particular ways in Christianity. So there you go.
Well, yes, I think that's, people often say to me, well, don't black folks want much of the get tough stuff that politicians are selling them? And it's certainly true that many African Americans want and have asked for more police in communities with high levels of violence, and many black politicians have supported get tough measures out of desperation to deal with real problems of crime and violence in their communities. But what's interesting is that the research shows that even black folks living in high crime communities are less punitive than white folks who face little risk of being exposed to violent crime. And so there is something happening here, with this punitive impulse that has much to do with race and isn't simply about our response to crime or fears about violence. But I think it is important that we own the fact that this punitive impulse lies within all of us, and that it isn't simply a white impulse to punish, but it's an impulse that seems embedded perhaps in aspect of human nature, to want to punish the other, punish those who seem different, punish those we are afraid of or fearful of in some way. And therefore, as we build a movement, it isn't enough to look over there and say, well, you all are so much more punitive than we are. We also have to be willing to look within our own communities. And, I can say for the black community, we have a lot of work to do too. There has been a lot of shame and anger and punitiveness that has existed within our own communities because we have blamed ourselves and one another for mass incarceration. And, part of the reason I wrote the book was to help people to see what I finally did, which is that we didn't ask for this system. We didn't bring this on ourselves. This massive new system of racial and social control has much more to do with our racial divisions, anxieties, than it has to do with crime or crime rates or what's actually going on in terms of drug use or drug abuse or rates of crime in these communities. There's something much larger going on that we need to deal with and reckon with if we are ever not only to end mass incarceration, but break this habit that our nation has acquired of creating these caste-like systems in America.